The 20th of April 2026. Cold Baltic sky. No warning. No diplomatic preamble. No pause to think twice. Just the sort of morning that turns routine monitoring into the beginning of an one-minute crisis. Deep inside Gotland, at a NATO-linked Swedish surveillance node, operators picked up something that hit Allied command networks like a live wire. In less than 40 seconds, the alert had run from Warsaw to Washington. 12 high-speed contacts had emerged from the Kaliningrad military exclusion zone and were moving northwest at roughly 900 kilometers per hour. They weren't sneaking, quite the opposite. They were climbing openly, announcing themselves on the tactical display at Ramstein like a challenge thrown across a table. Then the electronic intelligence systems finished their sorting. The lead contacts were identified as 22M3, backfire sea bombers, supersonic, nuclear-capable, built for one very specific sort of message. Reach NATO's maritime choke points. Line up Kh-32 anti-ship missiles on carrier-sized targets, and remind everybody that Russia's reach had not, in fact, shrunk, ever. Covering them on both flanks were 10 fighters, a mix of Su-30SMs and Su-35Ss, spread wide in a proper combat escort. Their N-35 Urbis radars were already working the airspace, feeling around for threats, cataloging anything Allied within 300 kilometers. This was no training package, no joyride. It was a spear, and it was pointed straight at NATO's eastern edge with the kind of precision you only get from rehearsal, intent, and a lot of planning nobody talks about in public. What the Kremlin's planners had not fully anticipated, what their timelines did not quite capture, was the speed of what came next. Within minutes, an alert cascade lit up across 6 NATO members at once: France, Sweden, Finland, Poland, Denmark, and Romania. The result was the largest coordinated airborne intercept over European soil since the Cold War. Not luck, not improvisation. This was contingency architecture clicking into motion at machine speed, and below the dark water, there was already another move in play. That piece mattered just as much, maybe more. Moscow appears to have believed nobody had seen it, nobody had tracked it, and nobody would stop it. That belief did not survive the next few minutes. And before we go further, if you like sharp, high-stakes military breakdowns that actually connect the dots, hit like, comment below with what you think Russia's real objective was here, and subscribe to the channel because the next few minutes changed everything. Still, to understand why this moment was so dangerous, you have to back up a little. The 72 hours leading into the intercept were, frankly, a clinic in Russian operational deception. The layered kind, the sort intelligence services write papers about for years afterward. Since early April, Ukrainian drone units had been hammering Russian logistics hubs, command posts, and forward ammunition depots at an astonishing rate, over 11,000 drone combat sorties a day. That tempo was breaking up Russia's spring offensive before it could gather momentum, before it could settle into the grinding forward push Moscow had promised itself. The Kremlin, watching its eastern front lose oxygen under constant drone pressure, needed a diversion. It needed NATO looking somewhere else, needed space, needed breathing room, and over in the west, they had a ready-made distraction. At the same time, 3 U.S. carrier strike groups were deployed in the Middle East as part of Operation Epic Fury against Iran, the biggest American naval concentration in that theater since 2003. Intelligence people from Langley to Vauxhall were glued to the Strait of Hormuz, where U.S. planners were refining strike options against Iranian energy infrastructure. Washington was stretched. NATO's attention was split. Russia's general staff saw an opening small, precise, probably temporary. The 22M3s were never meant to fly into NATO airspace. That wasn't the play. They were the flourish, the bright object, the hand waved in your face while the other one reaches for the knife drawer. At 3:22, the French Air and Space Force detachment in Vilnius, the forward NATO air policing unit there, got flash priority intercept orders. Minutes later, Rafale F-4s were already rolling, afterburners lit, clawing upward through freezing Baltic air so hard it would have flattened thought into one narrow thing. Mission first. Everything else later. At the same time, Swedish JAS 39E Gripens launched from Ronneby and Finnish F-18C Hornets cut in from Rovaniemi, Polish F-16C Block 52S, and Danish F-16S joined too, all converging into the same intercept corridor. 2 years earlier, that six-country geometry would have been politically awkward and operationally slower. Now it happened almost reflexively. Sweden and Finland joining the alliance changed that equation, plain and simple. By 331, NATO fighters had visual ID range on the Russian package. The Tu-22 M3S were cruising at about 10,200 meters, their massive variable sweep wings set for efficient high subsonic flight, and hanging beneath them were Kh-32 anti-ship missiles, not dummy rounds, not training shapes, live weapons, each with a range beyond 1,000 kilometers and a terminal speed around Mach 4.6. That detail matters more than people think. Bombers carrying live anti-ship missiles are not flying a practice script. They are flying a weapons-ready profile. Add Su-35 escorts operating without transponders, briefing IFF contacts, holding a posture one decision short of combat, and suddenly the margin for misreading the moment gets very, very thin. Then came the weirdness. An E-3A Sentry AWACS orbiting over Poland began to see what one duty controller later called anomalous contact clustering. Technical phrasing, sure. In ordinary language, radar was showing things that should not have existed. A lot of them, the Russian bombers had switched on their electronic warfare suite, SPS-171, L5S, Sorbcia jamming pods, and they weren't trying to blind NATO fighters directly. Instead, they flooded parts of the medium frequency band with cascades of false returns. The Baltic tactical picture bloomed with ghost aircraft, hundreds of them, synthetic targets moving at different speeds and vectors until the sky looked packed with white noise. Imagine you're commanding that intercept, and your radar suddenly goes from 12 inbound contacts to something closer to 200. Which ones are real? Which ones are decoys? Which ones do you burn missiles on? That's the point of a trick like this. It doesn't just confuse sensors, it eats time. And time in air combat is oxygen. At 3:38, the whole picture tilted. A Royal Danish Navy P-8, a Poseidon, on what had been a routine cable monitoring patrol over the Swedish EEZ, reported something that changed the mission from tense to deeply alarming. About 60 nautical miles south of Gotland, inside the corridor carrying the Baltic cable system and the Scandinavian ring fiber, routes the hidden spine of European finance, military traffic, and civilian internet. The aircraft's magnetic anomaly detector hit on a ferrous contact. Not a whale, not weird geology, a submarine. The track was about 180 meters long, 10 meters across, moving at 3 knots, 60 meters down, and paralleling the cable route with deliberate geometry. That last part is what matters. Random underwater traffic doesn't look like that. Intent does. The contact matched an improved Kilo-class submarine, the so-called black hole of the sea. Russia's quiet diesel-electric platform, optimized for exactly these shallow, acoustically ugly littoral waters where nuclear boats get cautious. And just like that, the real Russian move became obvious. It was underwater. Of course it was underwater. The bombers, the escorts, the jamming, the six-nation scramble that was theater. Effective theater, to be fair. Loud enough to drag radar, fighters, and command attention upward to 10,000 meters while a submarine crept toward some of the most important infrastructure in Europe. Cut those cables and the Baltic states go dim. Cut them, and NATO's eastern coordination starts degrading in hours, not days. Cut them, and Moscow gets to shrug and mutter about geology, faults, regrettable accidents under the sea. They had form here. Nord Stream, Baltic Connector, cable incidents off Norway. Enough precedent to make everybody in the room take this seriously, and fast. At 3:41, The P-8A sent a high-confidence contact report over encrypted Link 22 to NATO Maritime Command at Northwood in the UK. That triggered an immediate subsurface alert, the undersea version of a flare gun fired indoors. Across the Baltic, 2 Allied diesel-electric submarines that had been lying under strict emissions control, quiet, dark, patient, received new tasking through extremely low-frequency transmission. The geometry below the surface changed right there. Surveillance became interception. Then, on the surface, matters nearly went sideways. At 3:44, one of the Su-35 escorts, Bandit 7, broke from formation and turned directly toward a French Rafale. Call sign Cognac 3, at a combined closing speed over 1,400 kilometers per hour. The French pilot had 19 seconds. 19. That's not enough time to philosophize. It's barely enough time to decide whether you're looking at intimidation, carelessness, or the opening move of a disaster. Cognac 3 lit the burners, snapped hard right, and dumped chaff and flares, the universal airborne way of saying, I see what you're doing, and no, I'm not backing off. At nearly the same moment, the Rafale's RBE-2 AESA radar achieved fire control lock on Bandit 7 at 34 kilometers. Not a casual scan, not a polite query, a lock. Any Russian pilot getting that warning knows exactly what it means. Somebody's finger is close enough to the trigger that the next sound in the cockpit might be the one that ends the day. Bandit 7 held course for 4 more seconds. Just 4. Yet in moments like that, 4 seconds can feel almost absurdly long, like time itself has made a mistake. The Russian pilot was testing the line, measuring how far NATO would go. Then he broke left and slid back into formation. Those 4 seconds were, in a very real sense, how close the Baltic came to an incident nobody could have walked back with press statements and diplomatic phrasing. By 3:47, the NATO intercept commander aboard the E-3 Sentry call sign Varna 1 made the move that reshaped the air fight. Instead of continuing a parallel shadow posture, which the Russians had clearly expected, the Rafales and Gripens executed a split encirclement. High-G coordinated turns peeled the Tu-2 M3 bombers away from their Su-35 cover and placed multiple NATO fighters on the bombers 6 o'clock at the same time. Surgical geometry, ruthless message. Your escorts cannot protect every angle. Your bombers are exposed. We can build real targeting solutions on your strategic aircraft faster than you can reposition. The backfire crews understood the message immediately. Within 3 minutes, they began a controlled descent and turned east, back toward Kaliningrad. Their mission profile collapsed in plain sight. The spectacle in the sky was winding down. Under the water, though, things were heating up. At 3, Chinzich Shidoi, a Swedish A-26 Gotland-class submarine operating in the southern Baltic's tricky thermocline layers, exactly the kind of home water complexity Swedish crews know, like muscle memory, gained passive sonar contact on the Kilo at 1,800 meters. The Russian submarine had slowed to 2 knots. That told Allied analysts one thing loud and clear: deployment phase. Slow speed, shallow approach to underwater infrastructure. The part where acoustic discipline matters most. And yet sounds began to leak. Tiny ones, hatch clicks from external equipment, faint changes in hull resonance, mechanical signatures consistent with preparations for cable cutting gear. All of it was being captured. The P-8A, coordinating with the Swedish submarine through encrypted sonar relay, dropped a carefully spaced pattern of DFAR sonobuoys into a 4 nautical mile box around the projected position. Not flashy, not dramatic, just a passive acoustic net tightening quietly around a submarine crew that had no way of detecting it. Every pulse of propulsion, every little breath of machinery, recorded, processed, relayed. The Russian captain had made a bad assumption. He appears to have believed that by staying inside the acoustic shadow of the bomber package and its jamming umbrella, he'd be masked from detection below. What Moscow's planners evidently failed to account for was that NATO had committed a second P-8A specifically to use that noise as a reference signal. Knowing exactly what the Russian airborne jamming sounded like, allowed Allied processing systems to subtract it from the spectrum and isolate what remained. The louder Russia shouted in the sky, the easier it became to hear what was sneaking beneath the sea. That is a rough way to build your own coffin, but there it is. By 4-3, the 222 M3S were already in orderly withdrawal toward Kaliningrad, and their escorts had eased out of their hardest intercept postures. At that point, NATO Maritime Command sent a coded instruction to the Swedish submarine. Demonstrate awareness. Do not engage. In other words, let them know they've been caught, but do not cross the line that turns this into a shooting war. The A-26 closed to within 800 meters of the Kilo's port quarter. Then it shifted its towed array into active pulse mode and delivered one single, brutally clear acoustic ping through the Russian hull. For submariners, that sound is instant language, no translation needed. It means, I have you. I know exactly where you are. You are not invisible. Then the Swedish boat went quiet again and disappeared back into the Baltic's thermal clutter. Inside the Kilo, the meaning would have been immediate. They had been found, tracked, hunted, and the platform that had just touched them acoustically was already gone again, invisible. The Russian captain could not fire on what he could not locate. He could not safely continue toward cables that were no longer unobserved. The mission, functionally, ended there. At 4-9, the Kilo broke off its approach and reversed to the northeast, heading for deeper water and, beyond that, the protection of Russian territorial seas, where NATO would have less room under the rules of engagement. As the submarine accelerated to 12 knots, pump jet cavitations spiked. That alone was valuable. The Swedish passive array captured it cleanly, adding a permanent new acoustic signature to NATO's sonar intelligence files. Russia's most advanced Baltic diesel-electric submarine was now in the Alliance's library, catalogued, studied, no longer a mystery, not a black hole anymore. By 4:14, the last Russian aircraft had crossed back toward Kaliningrad. The 222 M3S descended for approach. The Su-35 escorts tucked in close, transponders still dark, radio silence holding. No triumphant chatter, no visible flourish. Just the heavy quiet of a mission that had gone sideways without ever tipping into open combat. No missiles were launched, no torpedoes fired, no bombs dropped. And still Russia lost that encounter operationally, technically, strategically, in the air and under the sea, electronically and physically, in real time, and in the intelligence afterlife that follows any operation of this kind. The consequences of April 20 rippled well beyond the Baltic. They moved through NATO planning rooms, Kremlin threat assessments, and those sealed briefing spaces where Europe's real security decisions get argued over in low voices. Within 72 hours, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk told the Financial Times that Russia could attack a NATO country within months, not years. 12 months earlier, that might have sounded alarmist. After April 20, not so much. He wasn't speaking in abstractions. He had seen the after-action reporting. He understood what the operation really was. Not simply a test of NATO's air defenses, but a test of its response threshold. How quickly would the alliance scramble? How coherent would 6 sovereign militaries be under time pressure? How much hesitation existed between detection and decision, between decision and action? On April 20, the answer Russia received was simple enough. Almost none. 6 nations airborne in minutes. Subsurface contact established before the bombers reached the full intercept line. Undersea sabotage halted before a cable was touched. But here's the question that does not get answered in public, and it's the one that probably keeps planners awake in those airless rooms beneath Brussels. What happens next time if the distraction is bigger? What if the air package isn't 12 aircraft but 40? What if the submarine count isn't 1 kilo but 4 Yasin-M attack boats, each armed with Zircon hypersonic missiles capable of covering the distance from Kaliningrad to Berlin in around 4.5 minutes? That is faster than NATO's current intercept timelines are comfortable with, to put it mildly. And there's more pressure elsewhere. 3 U.S. carrier strike groups that might otherwise reinforce the Baltic are tied up by the Iran crisis. The Ukrainian front is burning through drone production at a rate that strains NATO's industrial base. Meanwhile, Russia's general staff spent April 20 measuring seams, where the gaps were, where response thresholds sat, where deterrence might blur into hesitation. Sweden and Finland have added enormous geographic depth to the alliance. Their accession effectively shut the Baltic into NATO space in a way Moscow plainly dislikes. But those memberships are still young, roughly 2 years old. Integration is still maturing. Interoperability is still being tested, not in theory but under pressure, in live operational conditions that a decade ago might have triggered immediate Article 5 consultations. The coordination on April 20 was excellent. Still, it relied on layers. 6 nations moving smoothly, a P-8A running some of the best acoustic processing software in service, a Swedish submarine operating in home waters it understands better than anyone else ever will, and the startling speed of machine-to-machine data fusion through Link 16 and Link 22, pushing targeting information so fast that minutes collapse into seconds. Take away one of those layers. Delay one key decision by 60 seconds. Introduce one communications failure, one political wobble, one ambiguity in the rules of engagement, and the outcome changes. The cables get cut, the bombers push deeper, the submarine completes its work and disappears before Allied subsurface assets can box it in. So yes, for now the Baltic remains a NATO lake, but lakes can still be cold, cables can still be cut, and somewhere inside Russia's planning apparatus, the next version of this operation is almost certainly already being drafted. Same board, new variables, tighter timelines. Lessons from April 20 folded into the margins. If you had been the NATO intercept commander when Bandit 7 peeled off and pointed straight at Cognac 319 seconds on the clock, no certainty about whether it was a bluff, a probe, or the first move toward a deadly escalation, what would you have done? That's not a rhetorical flourish. It's the kind of question these episodes leave behind. And one more. If Russia comes back, and it probably will with more aircraft, more submarines, and no intention of turning away, will 6 nations be enough? Will the coordination hold once there's sustained pressure, real casualties, public panic, all the ugly stuff? Will political resolve survive the first body bag, and the first broken cable, and the first ugly, confused headline? Those are the questions that matter now. The next big briefing, if you're following this broader arc, is about the 3 U.S. carrier strike groups now operating simultaneously around Hormuz. The Iranian underground nuclear infrastructure Operation Epic Fury still hasn't touched, and the strategic math underway in Tehran, Washington, and Moscow as 3 possible crisis theaters, the Baltic, the Middle East, and the South China Sea, edge toward danger at the same time. That's where this is headed, or seems to be anyway, and none of it looks calm.